Hey, welcome back to the channel, guys. If you're not already subscribed, hit that subscribe button. Also hit that notification bell so you'll be notified of when I post a new video. Way back in November of 2014, I posted a video called, I believe, Toilet Valve Stuck. And basically, it was in reply to a YouTube viewer who was having trouble disconnecting the plastic nut that ties the water supply to the fill valve. And I thought that was kind of unusual because generally plastic on plastic comes off, but they were having trouble and they requested I do a video about it. So I did the video about it, showed them how to go and make the repair or slice the nut and get it off. By the way, I'm going to leave links to that video in the cards above and also down below. And I keep getting inquiries from people saying, well, that nut came off, but they couldn't loosen the lock nut. They said that the lock nut wouldn't come off. Now, that generally happens if you have a brass valve in there, an old-fashioned brass fill valve. And way back in the day, some of the not so high-end manufacturers would supply you with white metal die-cast nuts. And they literally would get fused onto the brass, so if you ever had to go take it off, they just wouldn't come off. Brass to brass worked, white metal to brass never worked. And people are having trouble getting that lock nut off, and so they asked me, how do I do it? Could you possibly make a video about that? So this is going to be a short video. I'm going to leave, like I said, links to that video up above and down below. Go back and watch that before you watch this one, but basically, I'm just going to show you how to cut that lock nut off. You're going to have to put a new fill valve in. That's part of the process. But you'll be able to get it out and you'll be able to get the job done with very little pain if you follow my instructions. So I will see you in a second. All right, guys, here we are underneath the toilet tank. Now, this is a plastic fill valve with a plastic lock nut, which a lot of people have been inquiring with me saying that they can't remove the lock nut will not come off. I don't know how that's really possible with plastic to plastic, but listen, if it's happening, then the method for removing this is the same one I would use for a metal or a brass fill valve. In the old days when I started, this was brass, and if it was a better made fill valve, it had a brass lock nut. But a lot of companies made the brass fill valve and they would use a white metal die cast nut. And after being on there for a few months, a few years, that die cast nut was just fused to the male threads of the fill valve. And the only way to get it off was to cut it off. So this method is going to apply to the same for both. Now, if you have the room in between the tank and the wall, and you have an oscillating tool, obviously it's going to be a little less effort for you to cut these threads off and then slice up through the lock nut. But if you just don't have the room, the good old-fashioned method is to use a hacksaw blade. I use a hacksaw blade 24 teeth per inch. I use it inside of my little handle tool here. You can slip this hacksaw blade inside of this tool. It has a handle on it. I'll leave links down below to several types or brands of this little type of handle that'll hold your hacksaw blade. The other method is the LENOX mini hacksaw, which I use, but you have to have a lot of room because, you know, at the front of the blade, you'll see it only goes through so far. And then as you move to the back of the blade, you're able to cut through completely. But for this demonstration that you're looking at here, we are going to use the hacksaw blade. So here we are, we have a plastic fill valve, and we will assume that the fill valve or the nut that holds the water supply came off. Now you're having trouble removing this, and as I said, go back to that first video and you'll see where I placed a little 6-inch pipe wrench inside the toilet tank to hold back the fill valve while you attempt to back off this nut. It'll just hold the valve in place. But if this nut just completely refuses to come off, don't whack away at it and go and get a big wrench or a big pair of pliers and try to get it off, because I mean, you can crack the toilet tank, and that's one thing you want to do. So knowing that this thing is frozen, you tried to get it off, it just won't come off. This is what I'm going to do. I'm going to come in here with a hacksaw blade that's in my little handle tool, And what I'm going to do is I'm going to slice through this. This is what I do. This is how I did it with the metal ones, this is how I'm going to do it with this plastic one. So very easily, and the teeth on the blade are going to face away from you. So they're going to face away from you, and you're just going to cut through this. Now, obviously it's easy because this is plastic, but you know, you're going to be in a position where it's not that easy. I'm up on a bench, I'm making a demonstration for you guys, and you know, so just be aware that, you know, it's painful. It's just painful. It's just plain painful, and you're going to have to go through the pain in order to get this done. So I cut off these threads, and obviously, for those of you wondering, you're going to have to put a new fill valve in. I'll assume that's the reason you're doing this, is you're trying to replace the fill valve. So this is what I do. I take these threads off, and as you can see, now I have the threads, the male threads. I cut them off, obviously. Excuse me. I cut them off. And now what I do is in the best position I can get myself, I will cut myself up through the center as best as I can. I will get myself a spot that's comfortable. I'm going right up through the center, and then I'm going to cut all the way up to the toilet tank. And, you know, once you hit the tank, you can stop. You can hear that I'm hitting it now. Once I do that, I get myself a real thin blade screwdriver, like you're looking at here. And then I put it in that notch I made with the hacksaw blade, and I will twist. And sometimes you have to really twist. And I don't want you to use the hammer on this. That's the one thing I don't want you to do. And sometimes you may have to get up because there's like a flange on top of or a flare on top of the lock nut, so you may have to cut a little deeper in order for this to happen. So let's go through there again and see if we can cut through that flange altogether. Last thing you want to do is get a screwdriver and start banging on this thing, because you can cause more damage than it's worth. I don't know if you saw that, but that snapped and that lock nut went flying. But guess what? I got the fill valve out. So simply speaking, guys, that's how you do it. It's not exactly brain surgery, but if you have a lock nut that simply refuses to come off, just split that nut. And like I said, that nut has like a flare on the bottom of it. The flare part sits up against the bottom of the tank. You have to get completely through that. Now, especially if you have a metal nut. Now, with this particular nut here, it was plastic, so my force with the screwdriver actually popped it because it was plastic. But if it's metal, it's not going to come off that easily. You're going to have to get this saw completely up to the bottom of the tank and get through that flare. But guys, that's how it's done. I'll say it again, it's not brain surgery, but this is the way you can do it with the least amount of damage. And yeah, it's going to be, maybe hot and sweaty, maybe a pain in the neck. You're going to have to position yourself on the floor. You're going to have to do whatever you got to do to get it done. I mean, how do you think we did it back in the day? I mean, you got to do it, and you got to go through the pain in order to get the reward. And that's it, guys. So I hope I solved the problem on how you remove this lock nut. And that's how you do it. Now you go get your new valve, you put it in there, and you are on your way. So the three methods I use are a hacksaw blade. 24 teeth per inch. You want to have the teeth facing away from you. This is what I used way back in the day. And then, there are companies that make these handles that hold the blade in there, which makes life a little easier for you. So if you can get one of these handles, you can simply, what I did here is I cut the blade in half, slipped it in, and I used this to cut through the nut. I also use, depending upon the amount of room I have, is this LENOX mini hacksaw blade. But just, use caution because you can only get through so far here. You can see there's not much travel room. You have to get to here in order to get all the way through the nut. And as long as you have enough room, between the supply and the wall, you'll be able to do it. But you can start it with this and most certainly finish it with the hacksaw. Again, if you have a metal fill valve and you have the room and you have a multi-tool, you can use the multi-tool to cut the male threads off and go straight up through the lock nut. And finally, I will show you that nut that popped off that I split with the screwdriver, and you see this little flange here. This flat, if you will, sits up against the bottom of the tank, and you have to get through this completely in order to pop the nut. Now, it's obviously going to be easier to do with plastic than it is with metal, but you want to get through this complete flare in order to get that nut to separate it, because I don't want any of you guys getting a hammer and trying to pop the nut with a hammer, because it's porcelain. And you know, I don't know if you saw, but there was a little chip came out on the outer side of the tank here. A little chip of porcelain came out, which is not a problem, because inside the tank you have a big cone-shaped rubber washer on the new fill valve, and that'll take care of that. And the new nut that goes in there is going to have a flare on it like this, so it's going to be fine. It's going to be leak-proof. And there you go, guys. So I hope you enjoyed this. And again, this method works. You just have to go at it nice and easy, and you'll get the job done. So there it is, guys. There's no big mystery to this. You just got to go slow and easy. You would simply slice the bottom of the fill valve, or take those male threads and make them flush with the lock nut. Slice straight down the middle up toward the tank until you hit the tank. Get a thin blade screwdriver, split the nut in half. You're going to be good to go. Now, if you run across a brass fill valve that's in there with a metal nut, probably going to be easier to do with an oscillating tool if you can fit it. You know, most times I can't fit that in there. It's such tight quarters. And I always used a hacksaw blade until I discovered my LENOX mini saw blade. But again, it's the easiest method to get it out without killing yourself. If you watch the first video, I show you how you can put a little 6-inch wrench inside the toilet tank in the opposite direction on the fill valve while you try to loosen the lock nut from the bottom. But you can only force it so much, because you can crack that tank very, very easily. So guys, I hope that settled the question. I hope that answered the questions of all the people that have been asking me, how do you get the lock nut off? Well, this is how you get the lock nut off. It ain't brain surgery. I want to thank you for stopping by the channel. If you're not subscribed, please subscribe to the channel. Hit that notification bell, but the most important thing you can do is hit the like button. If you don't hit the like button, YouTube is just going to not show these videos to anybody. I want to thank you guys for stopping by as always. I look forward to seeing you in my next video. Stay well, and as always, you know what I say. Happy plumbing.